Empires can vanish almost overnight. 3,200 years ago, the brilliant, interconnected world of the Bronze Age Mediterranean suffered a sudden and total apocalypse. Palaces burned, trade routes went silent, and entire languages were forgotten, plunging regions into a centuries-long dark age. By the end of this exploration, you will understand how a perfect storm of disasters shattered an entire world order, and why its echoes feel unnervingly familiar today. Who were the mysterious sea peoples, the marauders blamed for this chaos, and were they truly the cause or merely a symptom of a deeper collapse? What can the ashes of these ancient cities teach us about the hidden fragility of our own global civilization? This interconnected world hummed with the rhythm of trade and diplomacy. Great powers like the Hittite Empire in modern-day Turkey, the new kingdom of Egypt along the Nile, and the wealthy city-states of Canaan and Mycenaean Greece were bound together by a complex web. They exchanged not just goods but ideas, gods, and even royal marriages. A merchant in the bustling port of Ugarit could unload copper from Cyprus, load it onto a ship with fine textiles, and send it to Egypt, where it might be traded for Nubian gold. Kings corresponded as colleagues, addressing each other as brother in letters baked onto clay tablets, discussing alliances, gifts, and even complaints about the quality of recent shipments. It was a sophisticated, globalized system that had endured for centuries, creating a sense of shared civilization and perhaps an unshakable confidence. But this glittering network had a hidden fragility. Its prosperity was built on a delicate balance, one that depended on stable climates, predictable harvests, and the uninterrupted flow of key resources over vast distances. When several of these pillars began to wobble at once, the entire intricate structure was left vulnerable to a shock it could not withstand. This globalized system was a marvel of its time, but it came with a hidden cost. Every powerful kingdom, every wealthy palace, was connected to the others like points on a vast, invisible web, and the strength of that web was also its greatest vulnerability. These societies had grown so specialized, so dependent on long-distance trade, that they could no longer function in isolation. The lifeblood of their economies and militaries was bronze, an alloy made from two metals that were rarely found in the same place. Copper might be mined on the island of Cyprus, but the tin needed to harden it into a usable metal often traveled from sources as far away as modern Afghanistan or Central Europe. Think of it as an ancient, slow-motion version of our own global supply chains. A single shipment delayed by a storm, a single mine exhausted or seized by a rival, and the entire production of weapons, tools, and ceremonial objects for a kingdom could grind to a halt. This interdependence meant that a crisis was never truly local. A drought in one region didn't just mean hunger there. It meant the farmers couldn't pay their taxes in grain, which meant the palace couldn't pay the merchants, who then couldn't afford to import the tin, leaving the king's army dangerously under-equipped. The system was optimized for prosperity in good times, but it had very little resilience, very few backup plans for when things went wrong. And as the 13th century before the Common Era drew to a close, things began to go wrong in multiple places at once. The stability of this intricate world depended on something far more fundamental than trade routes or royal treaties. It depended on the weather, and in the final decades of the Bronze Age, the weather turned against them. While the clay tablets of kings speak of wars and diplomatic squabbles, a different kind of archive was silently recording the truth. Deep within the trunks of ancient trees and the layers of mud at the bottom of lakes, scientists have found a grim diary of this era. The rings of trees from that time are desperately narrow, and sediment cores show long periods of extreme dryness. The evidence is clear and overwhelming. For decades, perhaps even a full century, the eastern Mediterranean was gripped by a severe and unrelenting drought. This was not a single bad harvest or a tough year. This was a climatic shift that reshaped the landscape of survival. Rivers that were once reliable shrank to a trickle. The fertile soils of regions like Anatolia and the Levant baked hard under a relentless sun. Crops withered in the fields season after season. The result was a slow-moving disaster of a scale these civilizations had never before faced. Famine began to spread like a shadow across the land. A letter from a Hittite king to his counterpart in Egypt, once filled with formal greetings and requests for luxury goods, now carries a tone of raw desperation. He pleads for an emergency shipment of grain, stating simply that his people are dying. This was the new reality. The palace economies, so finely tuned for exchanging gold and bronze, had no protocol for a world where the most precious commodity was food. When the grain stores ran empty, societies began to unravel from the ground up. Farmers, unable to feed their families, abandoned their ancestral lands. Herders watched their livestock perish and were forced to move with their remaining animals in search of pasture, often drifting into territories claimed by others. This created waves of displaced people, groups pushed into motion not by ambition but by sheer necessity. Villages on the frontiers became tents, crowded way stations for the desperate. The social contract between the ruling elite and the common people, already strained by the demands of the palace system, snapped under the weight of hunger. Why should a farmer send his last bushel of wheat as tax to a distant king when his own children were starving? Loyalty became a luxury few could afford. The drought did not march into cities with swords drawn. It did not cause the collapse by itself. Instead, it acted as a terrifying force multiplier. It took every existing weakness in that interconnected system and made it 10 times worse. Trade disputes became existential crises over food shipments. Local rebellions over taxation flared into full-blown unrest as populations had nothing left to lose. The climate crisis lit a very long fuse, transforming a world of relative plenty into a world of fierce competition over dwindling resources. In this new landscape of scarcity, where the old rules of diplomacy seemed to mean nothing, the stage was set for a far more violent kind of interaction. And from the edges of this stressed and fracturing world, new actors began to move, drawn toward the crumbling centers of wealth like moths to a dying flame. While drought and famine strained the social fabric, another force was eroding the foundations of these kingdoms from the inside. The grand palaces and vast storehouses were not just symbols of power, they were the very engines of a system built on deep structural inequality. For generations, the palatial elite had demanded ever greater tribute from the farmers, herders, and artisans who formed the vast majority of the population. Taxes were paid in grain, olive oil, textiles, and labor, all flowing upward to support the luxurious lifestyles of the few, the massive building projects, and the professional armies. In good times, this system could function, albeit with quiet resentment. But when the drought's grip tightened and harvests failed, the demands of the palace did not cease. In fact, they often grew more desperate as kings sought to fill their own dwindling granaries to feed their soldiers and retainers. This was the breaking point. Imagine a farming family, after a year of watching their crops wither, being forced to hand over the last of their seed grain to a tax collector. The choice becomes stark: obedience to a distant, uncaring authority or the survival of your own household. Across the region, this same desperate calculation was being made in countless villages. The social contract, the unspoken agreement that the people would work and pay taxes in exchange for protection and stability, was irrevocably shattered. The palaces had failed in their most basic duty. They could no longer guarantee safety or sustenance. Why would anyone remain loyal to a system that demanded everything and offered nothing in return? Evidence from this turbulent period is subtle but telling. In some areas, archaeologists find that grand palatial workshops were abruptly abandoned, with tools left where they fell, as if the specialized craftspeople simply walked away. In others, there are signs that fortified lower towns where the common people lived were deliberately burned, not by an outside enemy, but in what appears to be internal conflict. This suggests uprisings, a violent rejection of the elite class that had presided over their hardship. The kingdoms did not just face external threats, they were being hollowed out. A Hittite soldier stationed far from home to protect a trade route might hear news that his own village had risen in revolt, that the tax collectors had been driven out. Where does his loyalty lie then? This internal fracturing had a devastating military consequence. A kingdom divided cannot mount a unified defense. Troops may be reluctant to fight for rulers they despise, or they might be desperately needed back home to put down rebellions, leaving frontiers dangerously exposed. The mighty Hittite Empire, which once rivaled Egypt, did not simply fall to a single, crushing invasion. It likely succumbed to a death by 1,000 cuts, a combination of famine-induced migration, internal secession of its subject territories, and perhaps finally, a coup from within its own strained capital. The palace walls, so imposing from the outside, were often weakest at their foundations, where the loyalty of the people had crumbled into dust and anger. With kingdoms thus weakened, destabilized by climate and fractured by internal strife, the stage was now set for the final, most dramatic actors to enter the story, a wave of movement that would etch itself into history as a terrifying mystery. The first cracks in the world appeared far from the glittering courts of Egypt. In the rugged highlands of Anatolia, the Hittite capital of Hattusa stood as a masterpiece of Bronze Age engineering, a sprawling city of monumental gates, vast storehouses, and temples to 1,000 gods. Its walls were thought to be impregnable, yet around the year 1200 before the Common Era, a fire of unimaginable intensity swept through its streets. This was no accidental blaze. The heat was so great it vitrified stone, fusing bricks into glassy slag. The palace and temples were systematically put to the torch, and the city was emptied of its people, never to be reoccupied. The silence that followed was absolute. At the same time, across the Aegean Sea, a similar story was unfolding. The citadels of Mycenaean Greece, like Mycenae and Pylos, show clear signs of frantic last-minute fortification. Walls were hastily thickened, water supplies were secured within the citadel, and then, suddenly, all activity ceased. The Linear B tablets, the administrative records of the palace, speak of final, desperate assignments of bronze to armorers, and then the script itself falls silent forever. These were not random acts of violence or simple raids for plunder. The pattern was too specific, too thorough. It was the targeted dismantling of a political and economic order. The attackers sought not just wealth, but the complete eradication of the centers of power. They burned the palaces, the very symbols of royal authority. They destroyed the administrative archives, wiping out the memory of tax rolls, treaties, and land grants. They shattered the system itself. This first wave of destructions created a chilling geography of silence. A line of ruined capitals and abandoned strongholds now stretched from Greece to Anatolia, marking the frontier of a new and terrifying uncertainty. And as these old powers crumbled, the vacuum they left behind began to pull in forces from the periphery, groups that history would remember only by the fear they inspired in those who survived. From the ashes of Hattusa and the silent citadels of Greece, the wave of collapse surged east and south toward the last remaining superpower, and it is here, on the walls of an Egyptian temple, that we finally meet the agents of this chaos given a name. Pharaoh Ramesses III, in the 8th year of his reign, commissioned a monumental account of his greatest victory. The inscriptions at Medinet Habu are not subtle. They speak of a conspiracy of foreign lands, a sudden, coordinated assault from both the sea and the dry land, a threat unlike any Egypt had ever faced. The invaders are called collectively the peoples of the sea. This is not their own name for themselves. It is the label given by the terrified and the victorious, a single, terrifying title for a multitude. The reliefs carved beside these boasts are our only contemporary visual evidence. They show a fierce naval battle, with distinct styles of ships clashing in the Nile Delta. The Egyptian vessels are orderly, with rows of oarsmen and archers firing from secure decks. The enemy ships are different, sleeker, with high, bird-like prows. Their warriors wear horned helmets or feathered headdresses, and they fight from decks crowded with round shields. But who were these warriors with the strange helmets? The Egyptian records list their tribes, names that echo with mystery: the Peliset, the T, Jekka, the Shekelesh, the Denyon, and the Weshesh. For over a century, scholars have treated these names like pieces of a shattered mosaic, trying to fit them to known places. Could the Peliset be the Philistines, who later settled on the coast of Canaan? Could the Denyon be connected to the Danaioi, a Homeric name for the Greeks? Perhaps the Shekelesh hailed from Sicily, or the T, Jekka, from somewhere in Anatolia. The frustrating, fascinating truth is that the Sea Peoples were almost certainly not a single ethnic group or a unified nation with a homeland. They were something far more symptomatic of the collapsing age, a confederation of the desperate and the ambitious. Picture the displaced farmers from drought-stricken Anatolia, the unemployed mercenaries whose Hittite employers no longer existed, the coastal raiders from the islands whose trade partners had vanished, and the opportunistic warriors from the western Mediterranean, all drawn toward the last source of wealth and grain, Egypt. They were less an invading army and more a perfect storm of human movement, a snowball rolling downhill, gathering disparate groups into a force that could topple kingdoms. Their power came from their composition, a mix of land fighters and seasoned seafarers that allowed them to attack coastal cities from the water while their allies moved overland. They were not the cause of the collapse, but its ultimate expression, the human torrent released when dams of civilization broke. They moved into the power vacuums left by fallen empires, sometimes to destroy, sometimes to settle. The mystery of their origins endures precisely because they were a product of a world in fragments, a fleeting alliance of peoples who, after their defeat by Ramesses, melted back into the obscurity from which they came, leaving behind only their fearsome reputation and a question that defines the end of the Bronze Age. Ramesses III was not the first pharaoh to face this storm. A generation earlier, his predecessor Merneptah had already fought a desperate battle for survival. His victory inscription, carved on a great stone slab, boasts of triumph over a Libyan invasion, but within its lines lies a crucial, chilling detail. The text casually mentions defeating a people called the Ekwesh, who are described as being of the countries of the sea. This is the first known reference in history to what would become known as the Sea Peoples. Merneptah's account suggests these seaborne warriors were already active, already testing the defenses of the great powers, decades before the climactic assaults on Egypt. This means the crisis was not a single event, but a rolling wave of pressure that built over a lifetime, pushing against the borders of the civilized world until the final, massive surge. But it is Ramesses III who provides our most vivid and terrifying portrait. His great memorial temple at Medinet Habu is not just a place of worship, it is a monumental piece of propaganda carved in stone, a declaration that he alone stood between order and total oblivion. The walls tell a story of unprecedented peril. The inscriptions speak of a coordinated conspiracy, a movement of nations that laid a plan in their islands and who suddenly, in one united motion, swept toward Egypt. They came by land and by sea, a pincer movement meant to overwhelm the last bastion of Bronze Age power. The reliefs depicting the naval battle are astonishing in their detail. We see the chaos of close combat on the Nile. Egyptian archers, standing firm on their decks, rain arrows down on the enemy vessels. The Sea People's ships are unlike the Egyptian models, with high, graceful prows shaped like birds' heads. Their warriors are depicted in mid-action, some falling into the water, others fighting desperately. They wear distinctive feathered or horned helmets and carry round shields, a uniform that sets them apart visually from any known Egyptian foe. One poignant scene shows the aftermath, with Egyptian soldiers methodically counting the hands of the fallen to tally the dead, a grim bureaucratic end to a fight for civilization itself. Egypt survived, but the victory was pyrrhic and transformative. The cost of turning back this tidal wave of humanity was staggering. The kingdom's treasury was exhausted, its military strained to the breaking point. More importantly, the world it had known was gone. The great network of trade and diplomacy with the Hittites, with Mycenae, with the cities of the Levant, had been irrevocably severed. Egypt entered a long period of inward focus and gradual decline, no longer an active player in a wider world because that wider world had simply ceased to exist. This is the ultimate value of the Egyptian testimony. It is not a neutral historical record. It is a view from the eye of the hurricane. It confirms the sheer scale and coordinated nature of the threat, a multi-pronged invasion that required a total mobilization to defeat. It gives faces in the form of those carved helmets and shields to an otherwise shadowy force, and it underscores a profound truth that Egypt's survival was the exception that proved the rule. Every other major kingdom in the region had already been swept away. The inscriptions at Medinet Habu are a victory monument, yes, but they are also a haunting obituary for an entire age, written by the only civilization left standing to tell the tale. The names carved into Ramesses' victory monument are echoes from a vanished world. Peliset, T-Jekka, Shekelesh, Denyon, Weshesh. These are not the names they called themselves, but labels given by the scribes of a terrified empire. For over a century, historians and archaeologists have treated these words like fragments of a broken code, trying to match each one to a place on a map, to transform myth into geography. The most famous and successful of these connections involves the Peliset. Linguistic and archaeological evidence strongly suggests these warriors did not vanish after their defeat. Instead, they settled on the southern coast of Canaan, in the very lands the Bible would later identify as Philistia. The Philistines, remembered as the rivals of the Israelites with their distinct pottery, their consumption of pork, and their 5 major cities like Gaza and Ashkelon, appear to be the Peliset, making a new home from the ashes of the old order. They were not destroyed, they were transplanted, their identity slowly blending into the fabric of the region over centuries. Another name, the Denyon, rings with a familiar Homeric echo. Could they be connected to the Danaoi, one of the ancient names Homer used for the Greeks themselves? This tantalizing link suggests that among these sea raiders were groups from the Aegean world, perhaps survivors or displaced peoples from the collapsed Mycenaean palaces, now turning their seafaring skills toward piracy and migration. The Shekelesh might point westward, their name reminiscent of Sicily, while the T-Jekka could have origins along the coast of Anatolia. Each proposed connection is a hypothesis, a best guess based on the slender evidence of similar-sounding names and archaeological traces. But the collective picture these clues paint is profoundly important. It suggests the Sea Peoples were not a monolithic horde from a single, unknown homeland. They were a coalition of disparate groups, a gathering storm of different cultures and languages, all swept up in the same catastrophic current. Imagine a refugee crisis on a Bronze Age scale, where drought and famine pushed entire communities from their ancestral lands in Anatolia, while the collapse of palatial economies in Greece left soldiers and sailors without employment. Add to this opportunistic raiders from the islands and coasts of the Mediterranean, and you have a recipe for a mixed, mobile force. They were a diaspora of the desperate and the ambitious, their old identities blurred by shared hardship and a common direction toward the last remaining sources of wealth. Their unity was likely temporary, forged in the moment of movement and conflict, which explains why they melted from history as quickly as they appeared. Once the pressure was released, after defeat by Egypt or successful settlement in new lands like Philistia, the alliance dissolved. The individuals and families within these groups gradually assimilated, their origins remembered only in the enemy's stone chronicles and in the faint cultural fingerprints they left in the soil. Decoding their names does not solve the mystery of the sea peoples, it deepens it. It transforms them from a faceless wave of destruction into a human story of displacement, adaptation, and survival, revealing the true complexity of a world unraveling. The true measure of a collapse is not found in grand monuments, but in the quiet, desperate words of those who lived through it. In the ruins of the great port city of Ugarit, on the coast of modern-day Syria, archaeologists made a discovery that turned history from an abstraction into a visceral, human moment. It was a single, unfinished clay tablet left in the kiln where it was being fired for preservation. This was not a royal chronicle or a treaty. It was a frantic letter, the last message sent from a king who could see the end approaching. The king of Ugarit, a vital hub in the Bronze Age trade network, was writing to the king of Elashia, the ancient name for Cyprus. His words are stripped of all royal ceremony, raw with urgency. He writes, "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came, my cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country." You can almost hear the panic, the smoke on the horizon, the sound of alarm bells ringing through the streets. This is the voice of a man watching his world dissolve into fire and chaos. But the true horror of this tablet is not in the plea, it is in the reply. Scratched onto the same piece of clay below the king's desperate message is the answer from Elashia. It is devastating in its brevity and its finality. It reads, "It is your problem. No offers of aid, no promises of solidarity, just a cold, stark admission of helplessness or perhaps indifference." This exchange, frozen in clay, captures the absolute breakdown of the international system. The old bonds of brotherhood between kings, the complex web of mutual defense and diplomatic obligation, had utterly shattered. Every city, every kingdom was now an island, facing the encroaching tide alone. Ugarit was burned to the ground shortly after this letter was written, never to be rebuilt. The tablet survived only because the fire that destroyed the city finished the baking process the scribe had begun, hardening this record of a final, unanswered cry for help into a permanent artifact. It is a haunting time capsule, proving that in the end, as the structures of civilization crumbled, the only certainty was isolation. This relentless mobility was their greatest weapon, a form of warfare perfectly adapted to a world coming apart at the seams. The Sea Peoples did not fight like the empires they toppled. They were not a stationary army defending a border or laying siege to a single city for months. They were a fluid, amphibious force, a storm that could appear on the horizon or over the next hill without warning. Their strategy was one of shock and relentless attrition, and it relied on two key elements working in terrifying concert: the sea and the land. From the water, their distinctive ships with those high, bird-like prows we see in Egyptian carvings gave them a speed and reach that traditional kingdoms could not match. They were not deep-water sailors in the age of exploration sense, but masters of the coastal highways. They could move hundreds of warriors along a shoreline in a matter of days, appearing suddenly at a wealthy, poorly defended port city, striking before any meaningful defense could be organized, and then vanishing back into the blue before a royal army could march to the scene. Think of it as lightning-fast, hit-and-run tactics on a civilization-ending scale. A city like Ugarit, for all its wealth, might have had only a local garrison, utterly unprepared for an armada, disgorging a seasoned fighting force directly onto its docks. But their power was not just naval. The Egyptian records are explicit. They came by land and by sea. This reveals the other, often overlooked half of their strength, the ox-cart armies. Inscriptions describe them moving with their families and possessions in heavy, slow-rolling carts pulled by oxen. This is a critical detail. It tells us these were not just raiding parties, but migrations of entire communities, warriors, women, children, and elders carrying everything they owned. This transformed their military campaigns. The warriors fought not just for plunder, but for a new home, for the survival of their families trailing behind them. This made them desperate and relentless in a way a hired soldier or a conscripted farmer could never be. The ox carts also provided a mobile, fortified supply line, a rolling base camp that moved with the fighting force. They did not need to maintain long supply chains back to a distant homeland because their homeland was traveling with them. This combination was devastating. The ships provided the strategic speed and surprise, allowing them to bypass fortified land borders and strike the soft underbelly of a kingdom, its rich coastal cities. Meanwhile, the land contingent, protected by its warriors, could move overland, perhaps converging with the fleet at a predetermined point, or sweeping through agricultural hinterlands, gathering supplies and adding to the chaos. A traditional army, like that of the Hittites or Egyptians, was designed to fight other traditional armies, to meet a known enemy at a known border. They were utterly confounded by an enemy that refused to stand and fight a decisive battle, an enemy that was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, that could burn a city on the coast one week and be 50 miles inland the next. The Sea Peoples did not need to defeat these empires in open field combat. They simply needed to outlast them, to keep moving, burning, and disrupting until the complex, fragile systems of palace and trade that held those empires together snapped under the strain. They were less an army and more a force of nature, a human hurricane that exploited every crack in the old world's foundations. The vibrant hum of commerce across the Mediterranean fell silent. With ports like Ugarit reduced to ash and the sea lanes patrolled by predators, the economic heart of the Bronze Age world suffered a sudden, catastrophic cardiac arrest. This was not merely a recession, it was the total cessation of a system that had nourished empires for centuries. The flow of vital goods simply stopped. No more copper ingots from Cyprus sailed east, no more shipments of precious tin, the essential ingredient for bronze, arrived from distant mines. The luxurious exchange of ivory, fine oils, and glass that had defined elite culture evaporated. But the silence was more than material, it was also intellectual. The diplomatic letters, those clay tablets addressed to "my brother," ceased to be written because there were no more brothers left to receive them. The great network of communication and mutual obligation was severed, leaving each surviving city utterly alone in a darkened world. This economic collapse struck directly at the foundation of palace power. These centralized states were not self-sufficient. They were vast redistribution machines. They collected taxes in the form of raw materials and agricultural surplus, then used that wealth to fund everything that made them a civilization. They paid the soldiers who guarded the frontiers, the artisans who crafted exquisite goods and weapons, and the scribes who managed the complex bureaucracy of empire. The palace was the bank, the warehouse, and the payroll office all in one. When trade vanished, the treasury's most valuable assets, stockpiles of bronze and luxury items, became functionally worthless. You cannot feed an army with a room full of unused copper ingots. You cannot pay a scribe with a jar of perfumed oil if there is no market to sell it. The economic engine sputtered and died. The consequences unfolded with brutal logic. First, the professional armies dissolved. Without regular payments in silver or rations, soldiers had no reason to remain loyal. A Hittite garrison commander on a remote frontier, cut off from messages and supplies, would eventually have to choose between starvation or abandoning his post, perhaps turning to banditry or offering his sword to the highest bidder, even if that bidder was a sea people's chieftain. Next, the specialized artisans, the makers of chariots, the sculptors, the weavers of royal garments, found their patron gone and their skills suddenly irrelevant. Their intricate crafts required materials that could no longer be imported and a wealthy clientele that no longer existed. Many likely returned to subsistence farming if land was available, or joined the growing pools of displaced people. Finally, the bureaucracy, the system of scribes and administrators that managed this complexity, became an empty shell. There were no more tax rolls to update, no inventories to take, no treaties to record. The very act of writing in scripts like Linear B or cuneiform became a skill without a purpose, and within a generation or two, it was forgotten entirely. This transformation is what separates a political defeat from a civilizational collapse. A kingdom can lose a war, pay tribute, and eventually recover. But when the entire economic and intellectual framework that sustains a way of life disappears, there is no quick recovery. Regions were plunged into an isolation they had not known for half a millennium. Communities that had once been connected to a global exchange of ideas and goods now had to focus solely on local survival. Pottery became simpler, more utilitarian. Architecture became less monumental. The grand narratives of gods and kings, once recorded in temples and archives, faded into oral traditions and then into myth. The poverty was not just material, it was cultural and technological. The loss of the tin trade meant the knowledge of advanced bronze working slowly dissipated, leading to a period often called a Dark Age, where the use of iron was still nascent and crude. The economic cardiac arrest did more than topple kingdoms. It erased the very memory of how they had functioned, leaving behind a landscape of ruins and a profound, centuries-long silence. The silence that fell over Greece was not merely political, it was absolute. While Egypt managed to survive, though battered, and new groups settled along the coasts of the Levant, the Mycenaean world experienced something far more profound, a near-total erasure. The collapse here was so complete that it plunged the region into what scholars now call the Greek Dark Ages, a period of roughly 400 years where the very memory of the previous civilization seemed to vanish from the land. This was not a simple change in leadership or a period of economic hardship. It was a civilizational reset. The grand palace complexes at places like Mycenae and Pylos, with their storerooms and administrative wings, were not just burned, they were abandoned and left to crumble. No one returned to rebuild on the same scale. No new king tried to restore the old order. The population itself plummeted, with estimates suggesting a drop of as much as 90% in some areas. Where there had been bustling towns and extensive farming networks, the landscape slowly rewildered, and people retreated into small, scattered, and fiercely isolated villages. The most telling loss, however, was not of stone and mortar but of memory. The Linear B script, the writing system used by the Mycenaean palace bureaucrats to record inventories, offerings, and personnel, was completely forgotten. With it, the ability to write, to keep complex records, or to compose literature disappeared for centuries. This loss is why we have no Greek account of their own downfall. The people who lived through the collapse and their children and their grandchildren had no way to write down what happened. The events passed from living history into vague legend, and then into the realm of prehistory, known only by the ruins under their feet. Imagine a society so thoroughly unraveled that it forgets how to read and write its own language. The intricate frescoes depicting warriors and processions faded from crumbling walls. The art of working inlaid gold and crafting delicate seal stones was lost. Trade with the wider Mediterranean world ceased entirely, leaving communities to rely solely on what they could produce within walking distance. Pottery, once decorated with elaborate marine and geometric patterns, became simple and utilitarian, a clear archaeological signal of a turned inward, subsistence-level existence. This cultural amnesia meant that when Greek civilization eventually re-emerged centuries later, its people had no direct, written connection to their Bronze Age ancestors. The great citadels like Mycenae and Turin were seen not as the ruins of their own forebears, but as the cyclopean work of a mythical, heroic race, a race memorialized in the epic poems of Homer. The Trojan War, as sung by bards, became a shimmering, half-remembered myth set in a lost age of giants, its roots possibly stretching back to the final, chaotic conflicts of the collapsing Bronze Age world. The Greek Dark Ages stand as the ultimate case study in the depth of this collapse. It shows that the disaster was not just about burning palaces or displacing populations. It was about severing the thread of cultural continuity itself. For 4 centuries, the light of complex society in Greece was not dimmed. It was extinguished, and what grew back, while magnificent, was something entirely new, born from the long, quiet aftermath of a forgotten apocalypse. Yet from this profound silence, a new sound began to emerge, the ringing hammer of a different metal. The catastrophic disruption of the Bronze Age world did not lead to a permanent Dark Age, but rather forced a profound technological pivot, one that would ultimately forge the foundations of a new era. With the international tin trade shattered, the once reliable recipe for bronze became a formula for scarcity. Copper was still available, but without its crucial partner, the alloy that had defined an age was now incredibly difficult to produce on a large scale. This scarcity created a powerful incentive to perfect an alternative that had been known, but largely overlooked for centuries: the smelting of iron. The knowledge of iron was not new. Isolated artifacts and evidence of small-scale production exist from much earlier periods. But iron had a significant drawback: it was notoriously difficult to work. Early iron was often softer and less reliable than good bronze, requiring a more complex and fuel-intensive smelting process to remove impurities and achieve a usable hardness. For the palace workshops of the Bronze Age, with their established supply chains and specialized bronze smiths, there was little reason to invest in this finicky, unproven technology. Bronze was the superior, prestigious metal, and the system was built around it. The collapse changed that calculation overnight. When the system vanished, the advantage flipped. Iron ore, unlike the rare and distant sources of tin, is remarkably common. It can be found in surface-level deposits in hillsides almost anywhere from Anatolia to Greece. A community no longer needed to rely on a fragile network of merchants stretching across continents. They could literally dig the raw material for tools and weapons out of the ground near their own village. The technology, while challenging, could be localized. This was the key innovation born from catastrophe. The loss of the centralized, specialized bronze economy democratized metal production. It moved from the exclusive domain of the palace, dependent on long-distance trade, to the realm of the local blacksmith, reliant on local resources and skill. Over generations of trial and error, through the quiet centuries of the so-called Dark Ages, these smiths gradually improved their techniques. They learned to achieve higher temperatures and to add carbon during the smelting process, creating steel, a metal that was not only more abundant than bronze, but ultimately harder, sharper, and more durable. The humble village smithy, not the grand royal workshop, became the engine of this revolution. This shift had deep social implications. Iron tools meant more efficient plows, leading to better agricultural yields from marginal land. Iron weapons, once their production was mastered, could be produced in greater numbers, potentially changing the dynamics of warfare and defense. The new world that slowly emerged from the ruins was not a restoration of the old palace system, but something more decentralized, more resilient, and ultimately more widespread. The Iron Age did not happen because of the collapse, but the collapse created the necessary conditions for its ascent by breaking the monopoly of bronze. It is a powerful reminder that sometimes the very destruction of an old and rigid order can clear the ground for a new kind of innovation, forcing societies to adapt in ways that ultimately reshape the future. The shift from bronze to iron was a slow, grinding process of rediscovery, one that left few physical traces of its early, uncertain years. But sometimes the sea itself holds onto a moment of the past with perfect clarity. Off the Carmel coast of modern-day Israel, at a site known as Hishuley, Carmel, underwater archaeologists made a discovery that seems to have stopped time. Resting on the seabed beneath layers of sand and centuries of silence, lay the remains of a ship from the very twilight of the Bronze Age. This was not a grand royal vessel, but a working merchant ship, and its cargo tells a story interrupted. Scattered around the wooden skeleton of the hull were dozens of copper ingots, the classic oxhide shape familiar from trade across the Mediterranean. Analysis dates this wreck to around the year 1200 before the Common Era, placing it squarely in the turbulent decades when the world was coming apart. Here was tangible proof of the maritime network in its final, functioning moments. This ship was doing what thousands had done before it, carrying the essential raw material for bronze from the mines of Cyprus toward a port, perhaps in Canaan or Egypt. Then, for reasons we can only guess, it never arrived. A sudden storm, an encounter with pirates, or simply the misfortunes of ancient seafaring sent it to the bottom, freezing a single commercial journey in time. The rarity of such finds cannot be overstated. Organic materials like wood rarely survive millennia in salt water, making an intact shipwreck from this specific period an extraordinary window. It provides a blueprint for the seafaring technology of the era, showing the construction methods, the size of vessels that plied these routes, and the scale of a typical cargo. But this particular wreck whispers of something more. Some scholars have noted its location and timing and cautiously posed a question. Could this be a ship associated with the very forces that ended the age it represents? The Sea Peoples, after all, are defined by their maritime capability. They were not just land migrants, they were seaborne raiders and transporters. A merchant ship in the chaos of the time could easily have been captured and repurposed. Its cargo of copper ingots would have been as valuable to a migrating war band as to any king, essential for forging weapons on the move. The wreck does not prove this specific connection, but it embodies the blurred lines of that chaotic period. It is a ghost from the last days of normalcy, a vessel that may have begun its journey as part of the old world's trade and ended it, perhaps, as a tool or a target of the new world's violence. Such discoveries are more than sunken treasure. They are time capsules that force us to confront the human scale of history. Someone loaded those heavy ingots into the hull. A crew sailed it, watching the familiar coastline pass. Their journey, and its abrupt end, reminds us that the grand collapse of civilizations was built from countless individual stories, most of which vanished without a trace, leaving only a silent ship on the seafloor to hint at the world that was lost. One of the most persistent ideas for their origin points not to the east but to the west. This theory, often called the Northern Invasion or Domino hypothesis, suggests the Sea Peoples were not a cause, but a consequence set in motion far from Egypt. Imagine the first great palace centers in Greece and Anatolia falling to internal rebellion, drought, or perhaps an initial wave of raiders. The survivors of that chaos, now displaced and desperate, would have looked for new land. They gathered their families, their weapons, and whatever ships they could find, and they moved. In doing so, they crashed into the territories of their neighbors, who were perhaps already weakened by the same climatic pressures. Those neighbors, in turn, were forced from their homes, joining the growing stream of migrants or being pushed ahead of it. This created a cascading human wave, a domino effect of displacement, where each falling kingdom added its people to the tide rolling south and east. It was a chain reaction of survival, with each group fighting not for conquest, but for a place to settle away from the spreading ruin behind them. Within this churning mass, certain names from the Egyptian lists seem to point toward specific Western homelands. The Shurden, for example, are vividly depicted in Egyptian reliefs wearing helmets crowned with distinct horns or a disc with a central spike. This unique armor bears a striking resemblance to small bronze figurines found centuries later on the island of Sardinia. Could the Shurden have been warriors from that island, drawn into the eastern Mediterranean chaos, who eventually returned home, carrying with them stories and artistic styles that influenced later Sardinian culture? Similarly, the Shekelesh might be linked to Sicily, and the Lucca to the coast of Lycia in Anatolia. This theory is compelling because it provides a logical mechanism for the collapse. It explains the coordinated, multi-pronged nature of the attacks not as a planned invasion, but as the inevitable convergence of several refugee streams, all funneled by geography toward the last remaining prize, the fertile Nile Delta. They were not a united army with a single king, but a coalition of the displaced, their alliance temporary and forged in the shared desperation of the journey. The domino effect transforms the narrative from a mysterious external assault into a tragic human chain of events, where the collapse of one civilization became the catastrophe of its neighbor, until the wave finally broke against the walls of Egypt itself. But what if the enemy was not a foreign horde at all? A compelling and very different theory suggests the Sea Peoples were not an external force, but a symptom of a terminal illness already raging within the body of Bronze Age civilization itself. This is the internal upheaval hypothesis. It challenges the dramatic carvings on Egyptian temples and asks us to reconsider a basic assumption that the scribes of Ramesses were giving us an objective military report. What if instead they were crafting a powerful piece of political storytelling? In this view, the so-called peoples of the sea were not a mysterious coalition from distant islands, but a label applied to a chaotic mix of people already living within the borders of the crumbling world. Think of the desperate farmers who abandoned their fields, the sailors and fishermen whose trade networks had evaporated, turning to piracy just to survive, and the professional soldiers whose kings could no longer pay them. These were not foreigners, they were the disenfranchised and the desperate, the people the system had failed. As famine bit deeper and palace authority withered, these groups would have naturally turned on the sources of their misery, the grain storehouses and wealthy estates of the very elite who ruled them. A band of starving villagers raiding a local governor's compound, a group of unemployed mercenaries seizing a port town for its supplies, coastal pirates preying on the last few merchant ships, all of these could be seen from the palace perspective as a sudden, inexplicable invasion. The Egyptian state, facing internal unrest of its own, would have had every reason to frame this widespread social collapse as a foreign conspiracy. It is far more effective for a pharaoh to rally his people against a terrifying external enemy, a faceless horde from the sea, than to admit the rebellion is coming from his own hungry subjects and disloyal soldiers. This reframing transforms him from a failing administrator into the heroic defender of civilization. The distinctive horned helmets and feathered headdresses shown in the reliefs might not represent unified tribal uniforms, but rather the eclectic gear of various rebel factions, mercenary bands, and pirate crews, stylized by Egyptian artists into a cohesive, monstrous other. This theory forces a difficult but crucial question. Did the palaces fall because they were attacked, or were they attacked because they were already falling? The internal upheaval hypothesis argues for the latter. It suggests the true apocalypse was not a military invasion, but a total loss of legitimacy. When the people no longer believe in the system, when they see it as the cause of their hardship rather than their protection, the walls mean nothing. The greatest threat to a civilization may not always come from beyond its borders, but from the quiet, crumbling faith of those living within them. The ground beneath their feet was not a passive stage, but an active and terrifying participant. While drought starved the fields and social unrest frayed loyalties, another force of nature was delivering a series of brutal, physical blows. At multiple sites across the collapsing world, from Mycenae in Greece to Megiddo in the Levant, archaeologists have uncovered a perplexing pattern. The layers of destruction show clear evidence of catastrophic fire, but mixed within the ash and collapsed masonry are other telltale signs. Walls are found sheared and toppled in specific directional ways. Foundations are shifted off their axes. Great stone blocks lie as if tossed by a giant hand. This is the unmistakable signature of powerful earthquakes. The timing is too coincidental to ignore, suggesting that in the final, chaotic decades, the eastern Mediterranean was rocked by what some geologists call an earthquake storm. This is not a single tremor, but a cascading sequence of major seismic events, where the release of stress along one section of a fault line triggers movement on adjacent sections, rippling disaster across an entire region over years or decades. For the Bronze Age kingdoms already reeling from other crises, this would have been interpreted as far more than a natural disaster. In a world where the gods were believed to directly control the forces of nature, a series of devastating quakes would have been seen as the ultimate divine verdict, a clear sign that the cosmic order had turned against the ruling powers. The psychological impact is hard to overstate. If the gods themselves were shaking the palaces of kings into rubble, what hope could there be for mere mortals? Morale already low would have shattered completely, but the damage was devastatingly practical as well. A major earthquake does not just topple buildings, it cripples infrastructure. It collapses the thick defensive walls that were a city's primary protection. It ruptures underground water channels, cutting off vital supplies. It buries storehouses of grain and weapons under tons of stone. A kingdom could survive a poor harvest or even a rebellion, but if its fortified capitals were physically broken open by the earth itself, its ability to resist any subsequent threat evaporated. This geological wild card created a fatal vulnerability. Imagine a coastal city like Ugarit, its walls cracked and its population terrified by what they saw as divine wrath. In that moment of maximum weakness, with sentries distracted by aftershocks and repair crews scrambling in the ruins, the appearance of enemy ships on the horizon would have been a coup de grace. The earthquakes did not cause the migrations or the raids, but they perfectly primed the kingdoms for collapse. They were the knockout punch that followed the body blows of famine and unrest, leaving societies prostrate and unable to mount a coherent defense against the human tides that were already in motion. It was a 1-2 punch from nature itself, first a slow stranglehold of drought, then a sudden, brutal pummeling from below, clearing the way for the final act of the apocalypse. The end of the Bronze Age was not merely a story of endings, but also of difficult new beginnings. While empires crumbled and cities burned, some of the very groups blamed for the chaos did something unexpected. They stopped moving. Among the names listed by Pharaoh Ramesses, one in particular found a permanent home. The Peliset, after their confrontations with Egypt, settled along the southern coast of Canaan, in a region that would become known in history as Philistia. These were the people we now call the Philistines. Their arrival, far from being a temporary raid, marked the start of a profound cultural transformation, one that archaeology has traced in remarkable detail. Excavations at sites like Ashkelon, Ekron, and Gath reveal a sudden and distinct break from the local Canaanite culture. In the layers of earth dating to just after the collapse, a new style of pottery appears, beautifully decorated with bold, geometric patterns and stylized birds. This was not a local evolution, it was an introduction, a clear fingerprint of Aegean or Anatolian influence carried across the sea. their dietary habits set them apart as well. While their Canaanite neighbors largely avoided pork, the Philistine settlers embraced it. Archaeologists find significantly more pig bones in their early settlements, a strong cultural marker of different origins and customs. They also established new urban layouts, with central, open spaces that suggest a different social organization than the dense, winding streets of older cities. This was not a simple conquest. It was the painful, messy process of building a new life from the ashes of the old world. Over generations, these distinct markers began to fade. The unique pottery styles slowly blended with local forms. Dietary differences evened out. The Philistines adopted the local language and gods, gradually assimilating into the cultural fabric of the region. Yet their legacy was indelible. They gave their name to the land, Palestine, and they entered the collective memory of their neighbors in a dramatic way. Centuries later, their story was immortalized in the Hebrew Bible, most famously in the tale of a young shepherd named David and a giant Philistine warrior named Goliath. That legendary conflict symbolizes the long, complex relationship between the newcomers and the established peoples of the region. The Philistine settlement teaches us a crucial, often overlooked lesson about collapse. It was not a clean ending followed by emptiness. It was a catalyst for a new cultural synthesis. The old order shattered, and from its pieces, different groups had to find a way to coexist, compete, and eventually blend, forging the regional identities that would define the next chapter of history. The Philistines stopped being sea peoples and became something else, neighbors, rivals, and ultimately part of the story. The silence that engulfed the Hittite Empire is perhaps the most profound of all. Here was a superpower that had negotiated with Egypt as an equal, whose kings exchanged letters with pharaohs addressing each other as brother. Their heartland in central Anatolia was a fortress of civilization, centered on the magnificent capital of Hattusa, a city of towering walls, secret tunnels, and vast archives containing the secrets of state. And then it was simply gone, not conquered and absorbed by a clear successor, not gradually fading into obscurity, but utterly and completely erased from the living world. The empire vanished from history's stage so completely that, for over 3,000 years, its very existence was relegated to a few vague references in the Bible and Egyptian records, more legend than fact. Its language, a unique tongue we now call Hittite, fell into such total silence that it would take the modern decipherment of cuneiform in the 20th century to prove it had ever been spoken at all. This is not the story of a kingdom falling. It is the story of a civilization being unplugged. The archaeological record at Hattusa tells a chillingly specific tale. The city did not slowly decay. It met a violent, fiery end. Evidence points to a tremendous conflagration that swept through its streets, a fire so intense it melted stone and left the grand gates and temples as blackened shells. But the true marker of a total collapse is not the burning. It is what happened next, or rather, what did not happen. No one came back. The survivors did not return to rebuild their homes among the ruins. The site was abandoned, left to the elements and to silence for centuries. The imperial bureaucracy, with its thousands of clay tablets recording laws, treaties, and rituals, was incinerated or buried, its knowledge extinguished. This complete abandonment of the core territory is what separates the Hittite fate from others. While Egypt survived and the Philistines settled in new lands, the Hittite heartland experienced a civilizational vacuum. The people who had lived there, the farmers, artisans, and soldiers who made up the empire, seemed to have simply dispersed, melting into the highlands or migrating south and east, perhaps joining the very waves of displacement that threatened others. Yet the story has a fascinating, quieter epilogue. While the Central Empire died, its cultural echo persisted in fragments. In northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia, a series of smaller city-states emerged in the following centuries. Modern scholars call them the Neo-Hittite states. These were not a resurrected empire, but rather successor kingdoms, often ruled by elites who carried on Hittite traditions, art styles, and the use of Luwian hieroglyphic inscriptions. They were like cultural satellites, still glowing for a time after the central star had gone dark. Their existence shows that while the political structure was shattered, some threads of Hittite identity were carried away by the diaspora and rewoven into new tapestries. The total disappearance of the central Hittite state stands as the ultimate benchmark for the depth of the Bronze Age collapse. It demonstrates that for some complex societies, the convergence of crises was terminal. When the drought strained their agriculture, when the trade routes for vital tin were severed, when internal loyalties frayed, and perhaps when the final shock of invasion or earthquake hit, the entire system reached a point of no return. The palace could not feed the people, the army could not be paid, and the idea of Hittite identity itself lost its anchoring in a physical place. The empire did not transform, it dissolved, leaving behind only cryptic stone carvings on distant hills and a library of clay tablets that would wait millennia for someone to read them again. The story of the Bronze Age does not exist in isolation. Its echoes resonate across history, in the silent ruins of other great civilizations that once seemed unshakable. By placing this ancient apocalypse alongside other monumental collapses, like the slow unraveling of the Roman Empire or the abrupt end of the classic Maya, a sobering pattern begins to emerge. These were not random disasters but systemic failures, and their shared threads offer us a lens to understand not just the past, but the delicate architecture of our own world. One of the most powerful commonalities is environmental pressure. Just as a prolonged drought crippled the Hittite and Mycenaean food supplies, the Maya faced severe periods of dry weather that undermined their agricultural foundations, while shifting climate patterns and soil exhaustion contributed to strains within the Roman world. In each case, a changing environment acted as a relentless stressor, amplifying every other weakness in the system. Another thread is overextension. The Bronze Age kingdoms built a dazzling but fragile network of interdependence, reliant on long-distance trade for essentials like tin. Similarly, the Roman Empire grew so vast that administering and defending its borders became a colossal, unsustainable burden, draining its resources and stretching its legions thin. The Maya city-states, locked in intense competition and warfare, may have overexploited their surrounding landscapes in a bid for dominance, degrading the very environment that supported them. This leads to a third critical factor: social inequality. In the Bronze Age, the gulf between the palatial elite and the common farmer became a fatal fissure in times of famine. In Rome, a similar chasm between the wealthy patrician class and the masses, alongside a heavy reliance on enslaved labor, created profound social instability. When crises hit, the cohesion necessary for collective survival had often already eroded, as those at the bottom saw little reason to preserve a system that offered them so little. Finally, there is the element of external pressure, whether real or perceived. For the Bronze Age world, it was the movement of the sea peoples. For Rome, it was the migrations and incursions of various groups along its frontiers. For the Maya, it might have been intensified warfare between rival cities. These external forces rarely caused collapse on their own, but they delivered the final blows to societies already buckling under internal strain. Viewing the Bronze Age collapse through this comparative lens transforms it. It moves from a singular, mysterious event to a tragic case study in a recurring historical phenomenon. It reveals that the greatest vulnerability of any complex society may not be a lack of strength, but a lack of resilience, an inability to adapt when multiple pillars of its existence are shaken simultaneously. The interconnected global network of the late Bronze Age, for all its sophistication, had no backup plan. Its specialized parts could not function alone. This realization casts a long shadow forward to our own time. We live in an era of profound globalization, of intricate supply chains and digital interdependence that span the planet. Our systems, too, are optimized for efficiency and growth in stable times. The lessons from these ancient ashes are not predictions of doom, but urgent reminders of fragility. They ask us to consider where our own points of stress might lie, how climate, resource distribution, and social cohesion are intertwined in our modern world. Studying these collapses is not an exercise in pessimism, but in understanding. It is a way to listen to the whispers of history, urging us to build not just for prosperity, but for endurance, to create systems that can bend without breaking when the next inevitable storm arrives. 3,000 years ago, a shipment of tin stranded by a storm could paralyze a kingdom. Today, a single container ship stuck in a canal can ripple through global commerce, delaying everything from car parts to children's toys. The parallels are not exact, but they are profoundly instructive. Our modern world is built on a foundation of breathtaking interdependence, a digital and logistical web that makes the Bronze Age network seem almost quaint by comparison. We have created systems of immense power and efficiency, but like those ancient palaces, their very sophistication contains a hidden fragility. The collapse of the late Bronze Age stands as a stark lesson in systemic risk, the idea that a failure in one seemingly isolated part of a complex network can trigger a cascade of failures across the entire structure. For the ancients, it was the loss of the tin trade. For us, it could be a cyber attack on a financial clearinghouse, a pandemic disrupting labor and shipping, or a climate event damaging critical infrastructure. These are not isolated problems, they are stress tests for an interconnected system. The lesson from the ashes is not that complexity is bad, but that it requires deliberate care. Those ancient kingdoms optimized their networks for prosperity in stable times, prioritizing efficiency and the concentration of wealth in central nodes, the great palaces. They had little redundancy, few backup plans. When the drought hit, there was no alternative source of grain. When the sea peoples moved, there was no fallback defense line. Their resilience was an illusion shattered by the first major, multi-pronged shock. Our challenge today is to learn from that oversight. We must ask ourselves where our own critical nodes are, the points where too much depends on a single port, a single digital platform, or a single source of energy. Building resilience often means sacrificing a degree of peak efficiency for the sake of security and adaptability. It means creating redundant systems, diversifying supply chains, and strengthening local capacities so that if one part of the global network falters, others can compensate. Studying this ancient apocalypse is not an exercise in fear, but a masterclass in foresight. It reminds us that civilizations are not monuments, they are dynamic processes, and their longevity depends not just on their height, but on the depth and flexibility of their foundations. The ghosts of Hattusa and Ugarit whisper a simple, urgent question across the millennia. Are we building a world that is only brilliant, or one that is also enduring? The greatest mysteries are defined not by the clues we find, but by the profound silences between them. For all the shattered pottery, burned palaces, and triumphant inscriptions, the story of the Bronze Age collapse remains filled with echoing questions, gaps in our knowledge so vast they shape the entire narrative. The most haunting absence is a voice. We have no first-hand accounts from the sea peoples themselves, no poems of their journeys, no tales of their leaders, no records of their gods or their reasons. Everything we think we know about them comes from the terrified scribes of the civilizations they attacked, or the propaganda of the pharaoh who claimed to have stopped them. They are history's ultimate outsiders, defined solely by their enemies. This means we cannot truly understand their perspective. Were they desperate refugees pleading for a new home, or ruthless opportunists exploiting the chaos? Their motivations are lost to us, buried with them, leaving only the stark aftermath of their passage. This central silence creates a cascade of other uncertainties. Scholars still fiercely debate the exact sequence of events across the eastern Mediterranean. Did the palaces in Greece fall before or after the destruction of the Hittite capital? Did the drought trigger the migrations, or did the migrations disrupt agriculture and cause the famine? It is a classic historical puzzle of cause and effect. Some argue the collapse was a domino effect, where the fall of one kingdom displaced its people, who then toppled the next. Others see it as a simultaneous systems failure, where climate, rebellion, and invasion struck a weakened world in a devastating convergence. The evidence is too fragmented to settle the debate conclusively. We are left with a timeline full of question marks, trying to reconstruct a world-shattering event from pieces that do not all fit neatly together. This uncertainty stems from the nature of the period that followed, the so-called Dark Ages. These centuries were not just a time of poverty and isolation, they were a time of near-total informational blackout. The art of writing vanished in many regions, and with it, the habit of keeping records. Oral traditions faded over generations. This means the very people who lived through the collapse and its immediate aftermath left almost no written testimony for us to find. Archaeology can show us the layers of ash and the new styles of pottery, but it cannot tell us the stories whispered in the villages that survived. We are, in a very real sense, trying to read a book where most of the pages have been ripped out, forcing us to guess the plot from a few surviving paragraphs and the illustrations. Yet, paradoxically, it is these enduring mysteries that make the Bronze Age collapse so endlessly compelling. The gaps in our knowledge are not failures of research, they are invitations. They allow for new interpretations, for scientific techniques like climate analysis and genetic studies to offer fresh clues. They remind us that history is not a settled fact, but a continuous conversation between the past and the present. Every new shipwreck discovered on the seabed, every new analysis of ancient pollen from a lakebed, has the potential to rewrite a small part of the story. The search for answers keeps the topic vibrantly alive, connecting enthusiasts and academics in a shared detective story that spans 3 millennia. We are drawn to this ancient apocalypse not because we have all the answers, but because its unresolved questions hold up a mirror to our own world, reflecting our deepest anxieties about resilience, interconnectedness, and the fragile threads that hold civilization together. The past is not a static thing frozen in time. It is a story we are still actively writing, with every new tool and technique adding sentences, correcting old assumptions, and sometimes revealing entire new chapters. For the mystery of the Bronze Age collapse, the future of discovery looks brighter than it has in a century, thanks to a quiet revolution in archaeological science. We are no longer limited to just what we can see with our eyes in the dirt. Now we can listen to the whispers left in human bones and read the hidden maps beneath the earth. Consider the power of ancient DNA analysis. For decades, the movement of the Sea Peoples was traced through pottery styles and enemy inscriptions, a shadow play of cultural influence. Now, science can look directly at the people themselves. By extracting genetic material from skeletal remains found in tombs from before, during, and after the collapse, researchers can begin to trace family lineages and population movements with stunning precision. Did the genetics of a coastal city in Canaan change dramatically after the year 1200? Such a shift could provide concrete evidence of new people arriving and settling, finally putting biological data behind the names from the Egyptian lists. Similarly, isotopic testing of bones and teeth acts as a lifelong dietary passport. The chemical signatures locked in your remains reflect the water you drank and the food you ate as you grew. By analyzing these isotopes, scientists can determine if an individual buried in a Philistine city spent their childhood far away, perhaps in the Aegean or Anatolia. confirming a story of long-distance migration, not just of culture, but of people. While genetics looks at the travelers, other technologies are transforming our view of the landscape they traversed. LiDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging, is like giving archaeologists X-ray vision. Mounted on planes or drones, it fires millions of laser pulses at the ground, penetrating thick forest canopies to map the subtle contours of the earth below. In regions once thought abandoned, LiDAR has revealed vast, hidden networks of roads, field systems, and small settlements invisible from the surface. This technology could completely reshape our understanding of the so-called Dark Ages. Were these periods truly empty, or were people simply living in a different, more dispersed way, leaving traces we could never before see? The picture of total collapse may give way to one of dramatic transformation and resilience. Meanwhile, beneath the waves, marine archaeologists use advanced geophysical surveys like side-scan sonar and magnetometers to map the seafloor with incredible detail. They are not just hoping to stumble upon a shipwreck like the one at Hishuley, Carmel. They are systematically searching for them and for sunken coastal settlements that slipped beneath the water as sea levels slowly rose. Each discovery is a time capsule, a moment of the past preserved in the stillness of the deep. Every scrape of the trowel in a new excavation, every sample sent to a laboratory for analysis, carries the potential to rewrite a paragraph of this ancient story. A single new tablet found in the ashes of a burned archive could contain a king's final, unvarnished assessment of the crisis. A detailed climate core from a new region might show the drought was even more severe or patchy than we thought. These tools do not just provide more data, they restore humanity to history. They move us beyond the grand narratives of empires and invasions, letting us see the individual journeys, the personal struggles, and the quiet adaptations of the countless ordinary people who lived through these terrifying and transformative times. The mystery of the Bronze Age collapse endures, but now we are finally learning how to listen to all its voices. The true scale of the disaster becomes clear only when we stop searching for a single culprit. There was no lone invader, no solitary earthquake, no simple drought that ended the Bronze Age. Instead, it was the lethal convergence of every possible stress, a perfect storm where each individual catastrophe amplified the others into a feedback loop of total destruction. Think of it not as a chain of events, but as a gathering vortex. A prolonged drought meant failed harvests, which led to famine and social unrest. That unrest weakened kingdoms from within, making them less able to maintain trade routes or pay their soldiers. The breakdown of trade then crippled the economies that might have funded a recovery, while seismic activity shattered the physical defenses of already struggling cities. Into this landscape of multiplying weakness came the movement of people, groups displaced by the very same droughts and collapses further north and west. They were not the first cause, but they became the final, overwhelming catalyst. The sea peoples did not create the storm, they were swept up in its currents, and their movement then became another destructive force within it. Each factor made the next one more devastating. A kingdom starving from drought could not rebuild after an earthquake. A city with cracked walls from a quake was an easy target for raiders. Raiders displacing a population created more refugees, who then put pressure on the next city down the line. This is why the collapse was so complete and so irreversible. The systems of the Bronze Age world were interconnected in prosperity, and they became interconnected in their failure. The resilience of the entire network depended on each part functioning, and when several pillars began to crumble at once, the entire architecture came down. It was a systemic collapse where the whole proved far more fragile than any of its individual parts. The mystery of the sea peoples, then, is solved not by finding their homeland, but by understanding the world that produced them. They were the human manifestation of this perfect storm, both a symptom of the crumbling order and a catalyst for its final demise. Their story is the ultimate lesson in compound vulnerability, a reminder that civilizations are most at risk not from a single threat, but from the unexpected convergence of many. Grandeur is no guarantee of permanence. The sudden apocalypse of the Bronze Age stands as a timeless reminder that even the most brilliant civilizations are chapters, not the final word. The mystery of the Sea Peoples is not just an ancient whodunit. It is a profound testament to the cascading chaos that erupts when complex, interconnected systems reach their breaking point. We are left to reflect on the sobering legacy of palaces turned to dust and entire languages slipping into a silence so deep it lasted for millennia. This story from 3,000 years ago pushes a powerful question into the present, forcing us to consider our own place in the long arc of history. We live in an age of stunning interconnection, of global systems that bear an uncanny resemblance to that ancient network of trade and diplomacy. Our world, too, is built on delicate balances of climate, resources, and social trust. The past does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes, and the echoes from this collapse are a haunting melody. The ultimate lesson may not lie in the spectacular fall, but in the quiet aftermath. For those who survived the darkness, the following centuries were not empty. They were a period of painful, necessary adaptation. They learned to rely on local resources, to forge new communities from the fragments of the old, and to slowly, painstakingly, rebuild a different kind of world on more resilient foundations. Their story is ultimately one of human endurance. It asks us what lessons in resilience we are building into our own societies today. Are we creating systems that can absorb shocks, or ones that will amplify them? The ruins of Hattusa and the sunken ships off the coast are not just relics, they are invitations to look forward with the wisdom of the past. If you found this journey into one of history's greatest unravelings compelling, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the puzzles and turning points that shaped our world. We would love to hear from you. Which fallen empire or lost civilization would you want to explore next? Let us know in the comments below.